Imagine this, a young Corsican officer, standing before the great libraries of Europe, devouring every book he could find about the titans of warfare. He wasn't simply reading about battles. He was dissecting minds, absorbing the genius of men who had shaped empires centuries before his birth. This man, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte. And while history remembers him as a genius in his own right, Napoleon himself admitted that his brilliance was not born in isolation. He stood on the shoulders of giants, studying and admiring the masters of strategy and leadership who came before him. Today, we're diving deep into the inspirations of Napoleon, the military geniuses he revered, the lessons he stole from their pages, and how those lessons would ignite his meteoric rise. Stay with me until the end, because what you'll discover isn't just about history, it's about how knowledge, when applied with ambition, can change the destiny of the world. Napoleon often remarked that a man should always have two pockets, one full of hopes, the other full of fears. But behind this aphorism lay a lifetime of preparation. He was obsessed with the study of history, believing, as he once declared, that war is the business of barbarians, if not guided by history. From an early age, in the military academy of Brienne, and later at the École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon devoured works on Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, and Frederick the Great. These were not mere stories of conquest to him. They were case studies, living blueprints of how to seize opportunity, exploit weakness, and bend the will of nations. As historian David Chandler writes in The Campaigns of Napoleon, few great captains ever prepared themselves more thoroughly for the practice of their art. Napoleon's mind was a storehouse of classical and modern campaigns alike, and his ability to apply old principles to new conditions set him apart. One of Napoleon's earliest and most enduring fascinations was Alexander the Great. Here was a man who, before the age of 30, had carved out an empire stretching from Greece to India. Alexander's audacity, his willingness to march into the unknown, and his capacity to inspire loyalty among men from a dozen nations, struck a chord with the young Bonaparte. Napoleon admired Alexander, his ability to make his soldiers believe they were part of something larger than themselves, a theme Napoleon would later replicate in his own army, turning ragged recruits into the Grande convinced they were shaping the fate of Europe. Alexander showed us that in war, Napoleon once said, spirit counts for as much as numbers. But if Alexander taught Napoleon about audacity, Hannibal Barca of Carthage taught him about cunning. The crossing of the Alps with war elephants to strike Rome at its very heart was a feat that Napoleon openly admired. Centuries later, imitated in the campaign of 1800, Napoleon himself crossed the Alps at the Great St. Bernard Pass, a calculated echo of Hannibal's audacious move. Edward Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, notes that Hannibal possessed that rare art of commanding respect through daring, and Napoleon, keenly aware of this, embraced the psychology of surprise. He once remarked, in war, the moral is to the physical, as 3-1. Hannibal's ability to shatter Roman pride at Cannae with a smaller force gave Napoleon a living example of how psychology and maneuver could triumph over brute strength. Julius Caesar, perhaps the most famous Roman of them all, was another of Napoleon's guiding lights. Caesar's writings, particularly Commentary de Bello Gallico, his first-hand account of the Gallic Wars, were not only a military textbook, but also a lesson in leadership and political mastery. Napoleon read Caesar's works obsessively, annotating them and applying their lessons. The clarity, simplicity, and decisiveness with which Caesar commanded became hallmarks of Napoleon's own style. Historian J.F.C. Fuller, in The Generalship of Alexander the Great, observed, Caesar and Napoleon were alike in their capacity to fuse politics and war, to see that the battlefield was but an extension of the state. For Napoleon, Caesar was more than a soldier. He was proof that the pen and the sword together could build empires. From antiquity to the modern age, Napoleon's inspirations expanded. He revered Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, the so-called Lion of the North, whose innovative use of mobile artillery and disciplined infantry revolutionized warfare in the 17th century. Gustavus had proven that flexibility and speed could topple even the mightiest of foes, a lesson Napoleon absorbed and magnified. Chandler writes that Napoleon took Gustavus' reforms and wove them into his own tapestry, creating armies capable of operating independently, yet converging with decisive force. Napoleon's core system, sufficient units capable of rapid maneuver, owed much to Gustavus's pioneering tactics. But perhaps the most direct influence on Napoleon came from Frederick the Great of Prussia. In fact, Napoleon once declared, read and reread the campaigns of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus, Turenne, Eugene, and Frederick. This is the only way to become a great captain, and whoever receives this advice will thank me if he profits by it. Among these, Frederick stood out. Frederick's victory at Leuthen in 1757, where a smaller Prussian force outmaneuvered and crushed a larger Austrian army, was a battle Napoleon studied meticulously. The oblique order, the concentration of force at a decisive point, and the psychological dominance Frederick wielded all became staples of Napoleon's own campaigns. Frederick the Great was the master of maneuver, wrote military historian Geoffrey Ward, and Napoleon his most gifted pupil. Of course, Napoleon was not a blind imitator, he was a synthesizer. He took Alexander's audacity, Hannibal's cunning, Caesar's decisiveness, Gustavus' innovations, and Frederick's precision and blended them into something uniquely his own. Historian Andrew Roberts, in Napoleon, a Life notes Napoleon's genius was not in inventing new methods of war, but in perfecting the old ones, adapting them with unparalleled speed to the circumstances he faced. At this point in our journey, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Why should we care about who Napoleon admired? Because it shows us something essential not only about history but about ourselves. Greatness is rarely born in isolation. Even the man once crowned Emperor of the French, commanding millions, looked back to the wisdom of those who came before. And just like Napoleon, we too can study the masters, adapt their lessons, and carve our own destiny. That's why, if you're enjoying this exploration of Napoleon's inspirations, I invite you now to subscribe to the channel. By joining us, you'll ensure you never miss these deep dives into the stories and secrets of history's greatest figures. Returning to Napoleon, it's worth noting that his inspirations were not static. As his career advanced, so too did the way he interpreted his idols. For example, in his youth, he idolized Alexander's boundless ambition, but as emperor, he came to see the dangers of overextension. His disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 echoes Alexander's march into India, bold, but ultimately unsustainable. Similarly, his admiration of Caesar taught him to unite military and political power, but it also made him vulnerable to the same fate, being seen as a tyrant and falling victim to exile and political collapse. Napoleon also studied and respected commanders like Henry de la Tour d'Auvergne, Viscount de Turenne, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, whose campaigns in the 17th and early 18th centuries provided him with models of discipline and persistence. So, when we look at Napoleon, we're not simply looking at an isolated figure of genius. We're seeing the culmination of centuries of military evolution, distilled into a single man. And what made him extraordinary was his ability to recognize that genius in others and make it his own. As Karl von Clausewitz would later write in On War, no one starts from scratch. Every commander builds upon the inheritance of the past, yet only the greatest can transform that inheritance into a weapon of their own making. Napoleon was precisely that alchemist of history, transmuting the victories of his idols into the empire of his own making. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson. Napoleon's inspirations remind us that history is not a series of disconnected episodes but a chain, each link forged by those who came before. The torch passes from Alexander to Caesar, from Hannibal to Frederick, until at last it burns brightest in the hands of Napoleon Bonaparte. His star would rise and fall, but his place among the immortals was secure not just as a commander, but as the heir to the greatest minds in the art of war. So, the next time you think of Napoleon, don't see him only as the conqueror of Europe or the exiled emperor of Elba. See him as a student, one who never stopped learning, who transformed admiration into action, and who proved that even the most towering geniuses are, at their core, standing on the foundations laid by those before them.